I want to talk a little bit about analogy and how it fits in our study of signs to this point. You've learned signs as a general term referring to any one thing that stands in the place of another thing when we are giving messages or when we gather information. Um, and we talked about the symbol, the icon, and the index. Of the three that I just mentioned, probably the more challenging to get initially, but then once you understand it, you can recognize it all over the place, is the index, which really does take you into the realm of the lived world, whether it be your kitchen or your bedroom or a street or your school or your work or the sidewalks outside. And you know how physical activity happens in the real world, so you can put two and two together. For example, if you walk out your door and you see that water is all over the ground, over the sidewalk, over the roads, what are your options as far as how water got there? You know it's not always there, so it arrived over the period of time since you last came into the house. And could it actually be that, say, a new lake is forming and water is springing from the ground because a spring opened up? Highly unlikely, right? Not impossible, but highly unlikely. Would you think that maybe one of your neighbors came with a huge hose and just hosed everything for hours while you were inside the house? Again, not impossible. The only thing impossible is a square circle and other things that destroy their own definition by negating terms. But yeah, sure, your neighbor, that's not impossible, but it's highly improbable that your neighbor came out. So when you see all that wetness out there, you draw the conclusion that rain happened, right? Even though you didn't see it, you may not have seen it. Well, that's how an index works, right? And index carries information about the lived world based on how events follow each other as a cause and effect. And so that's also considered a sign. Um, Icons and symbols are very often used in a two-dimensional realm where you can use them to in terms of like putting them on a page to deliver a message, like the symbols of the alphabet or the icons of drawings that resemble the things they're trying to represent. So, icon, symbol, and index. Well, I'm going to introduce you to another one, and it's not usually considered a sign in itself, but it really does act as a sign, and that's the metaphor. Now, a metaphor is a technique that we have, a sort of um, a device, a verbal device that allows us to use one thing to stand for another thing, and our audience understands it. Okay, so we're taking one thing and comparing it or equating it to another, and the points of similar connection between one thing and another is the value of a metaphor. Because if you know what being in pain is like because you've hit your finger on a thumb and then you've just had a very, very hard conversation with somebody, when you're talking about that to another person later, you might say it was like that conversation was like smashing my thumb with a hammer, and you're making this comparison. You see what I'm saying? And all of a sudden, the person you're talking to can kind of understand the information about the meeting you had. Obviously, there wasn't a hammer involved, but that carries the information of pain, of suddenness, of wow, that's overly harsh. It's one thing to hit your finger with a book, but to hit it with a hammer. All of this stuff is information that's carried over by the comparison. So comparisons like that are called analogies, and one type of analogy is called a metaphor. All right, now it'd be really great for you to go online and to get definitions of analogies and metaphors, to get examples, and to do an etymology search. Just a quick research on the root and the word history, the roots of the word in the language it's coming from over the years, over the decades, over the centuries. That's called etymology. Uh, Etymology. So analogy and metaphor. Now metaphor, we can get a little more technical, and we can assign specific names to situations. For example, some teachers, some people would like to say that if the comparison is direct, then it's a metaphor. But if it involves the word like or as, then it's a simile. Okay, so you might say that conversation was like hitting my thumb with a hammer. Then someone technically might say, well, that's a simile. Now, if you change the figure of speech maybe and you say that conversation was a train wreck, well, because there's not like and or as in there was like as a train wreck or it felt as a train wreck or whatever. The point is you made a direct comparison. The conversation was equal sign a train wreck. Some people will say, well, now that's a metaphor. Metaphor is much more direct. If you say that conversation was like a train wreck, then it's called a simile. To me, those are distinctions without differences, and that's a dangerous area because you present a vocabulary that is sort of redundant and meaningless. There's no real difference other than a technical difference, and it doesn't really matter in real speech, in everyday use. So whether you know what a simile is, the difference between a simile and a metaphor, it's not really the point. The point is that you know how to make analogies and that you view metaphor as a powerful tool for communication. All right. In fact, I'm going to go ahead and introduce you to two more terms because if you study metaphor and you read what's online, somehow these two terms seem to pop up, and we never really use them in real life. So, unless you're an English teacher or literature teacher, so here they are, but don't worry too much about always knowing the difference. So, a synecdoche is a type of metaphor that has a physical part of something stand for the whole thing. All right. So if we were to say something like, you know, take a ship, and someone might say, there are 5 sails on the horizon. Well, yeah, we know that the sails are actually there, but what they're really saying is there are 5 ships out there. Okay, let's just assume there's 1 sail per ship or whatever. So, at that point, a physical part of the thing is representing the whole, and that's a metaphor. But that's specifically called a synecdoche. This is actually not as uncommon as you might think. Like if you've heard the phrase "boots on the ground," that's a military phrase. Well, how many boots are on the ground? Well, that boots are a part of the soldier. So that's a synecdoche. Because the metaphor is the boots are standing as a sign for the soldier. You see what I'm saying? What you really see, you don't really care about the actual footwear. You're saying how many people, how many soldiers are on the ground, so how many boots are on the ground. Boots are standing for soldiers, and boots are actually part of the soldiers. So that's called synecdoche. If you think about the West and you talk about how many hands do you need to do a cattle drive, you're really talking about cowboys, right? Not literally hands, because you might say, well, we need three hands, and that means a person and a half because you literally need 1 hand, 2 hand, and a third one. No. The hands are standing for people. So since they're physically part of the thing that they are representing, that's called synecdoche. Okay. Now metonymy is when something that is closely associated to the thing it's representing, but not physically a part of it, is used. So think of Shakespeare does this a lot. In his history plays, he'll have an ambassador from a country, say France, be involved in the play, and in the speaker lines or the references, sometimes they refer to this person as France. France says, "Let's go to war" or whatever, because the person is representing France. But obviously, France is not a physical part of the person. So because there's such a close relationship, though, you can use one thing to represent another. And when it's closely related to that, in fact, they're sort of always in proximity. It's called metonymy. Um, we use this a lot too. For example, if you go to a picnic and you get yourself a plate, go get yourself a plate. And so if someone goes gets a plate and they're like, I already had a plate, right? You're at this picnic and someone is telling you they ate 2 plates. Obviously, they didn't eat the actual plate, right? We all know that. We ate the food that was on the plate. The food almost always comes on a plate, so you can use the thing that's very closely associated to something else to stand for that something else if you want to. So in that case, it would be plate. We use this in politics, modern politics, when we say the White House has decided, right, um, to do something. Well, obviously, we're not talking about the building. We're talking about the people in it, the administration in the White House. So that's metonymy, because we're using one thing to be a sign for another in our messages. One thing to stand for another. White House is standing for the people actually making the decisions, but the White House is not actually physically part of those people, right? It's just associated with it. It's part of the contextual surroundings, if you will. So you can use this in the house of in the Bible when it talks about the house of David. We're not talking about the physical dwelling. We're talking about David's family, David's line. And the house itself, the physical dwelling, if you will, that's not necessarily what that word is talking about. But we use this in modern terms as well in our branding. House of Mondavi, House of Gucci. We're not talking about the physical thing. We're talking about the family. The family. Okay, so you have the terms that I've introduced so far: analogy, metaphor, simile, synecdoche, and metonymy. All right. Here's the heartbeat of the lesson. Can you really become creative with metaphor? And can you use one thing to represent another in your communication? And can you also see metaphor as a type of sign, because we can sometimes bring in the metaphor and use it to represent something else, right? Um, so Um, for example, when you're talking to someone and you need a bit of extra time, you would say, "Give me a second. Would you please give me a second?" And then, you know how the game goes, right? That other person goes, "Okay, 1 second." You know, no, no, no. You just ask for a little bit of time. See, second is a part of time, and you really asked for time. You didn't really ask for the second. So that's synecdoche. It's a type of metaphor, and you used metaphor right there. You used it as a sign to represent something else. The second was representing a period of time that wasn't like a lot, but it was definitely more than a second, right? So metaphors are in fact a type of sign that we use verbally to facilitate understanding and to transfer messages. Now I'm going to throw another term in there, okay? And that's felicity. Felicity, that is related to um, the notion of happiness and of fit. Of fit. That's really the best part, is fit. There's a certain matching of honor and of grade, if you will, okay? For example, if you want to talk about um, a company that grows and grows and grows, and you're thinking about a metaphor for this company that's strong, that has this incredible growth, okay? You might want to talk about, let's say, you might want to talk about it as, you know, a, let's say a a plant, or you'd have to pick the right plant, not a weed, right? So that's what I mean by felicity. Like, if you might want to talk about it as a rose bush, that's kind of weird. Roses aren't necessarily associated with businesses. So what kind of plant? Maybe you were going to talk about ivy. It's like a wild ivy plant that's just spreading everywhere. Oh, okay, all right, I can work with that as long as it's not poison ivy. You see what I'm saying? There's felicity. The image has to match. The type of attitude, the type of description you really want to be at play. Because if you say, look, that company is strong and it's growing like a cancer. Cancer grows really fast. Cancer is actually kind of amazing. I'm sorry to say that because so many people struggle with it, but cancer is actually a shell that doesn't know how to die. It just replicates and replicates and replicates. But you should never say that some company is growing like cancer, unless you mean it has a horrible effect on people. Right? But if you're just trying to highlight the fast and impressive growth, Don't use cancer for that, even though cancer does have this notion of incredible growth mechanism or ability. There's no felicity there. The felicity has to match. There has to be, we have certain attitudes and feelings and emotions towards the word cancer that you don't want to transfer over to this other thing you're using cancer to represent when you say that business is a cancer. Right? People automatically think that thing is horrible to human beings when you might have been trying to say it's growing like crazy. It's an incredible growth thing, right? So felicity really does have to match, right? It has to match. So you have to think about these things and you practice them and get a little better, a little better. So um, use when you can, um, recognize metaphor in the speeches and conversations and texts that are coming around you, and understand that it's a type of sign. Get a little better at understanding it and just the workings of it, and then try to practice it in your own communication, um, so that you can begin to realize how powerful a good you know a good metaphor can be, a good strong comparison like this from one thing to another, and can how far it can go to help the understanding and the message you want to get across and actually stick.